Today I want to do a show for law enforcement officers, and I feel everybody can gain something from this show because it's basically a show that deals with social engineering, manufacturing consent, and obedience to authority. And these issues are something that our whole society deals with all the time. And if you want to discuss what the New World Order hasn't planned for you, it's basically an attempt to ensure that they have compliance and uniformity and obedience to authority. So, where do we start? How does one become obedient? We start off being born, right? So a child is born. I have a granddaughter just born. She gets nurtured by her parents. Her parents love her. Mother and father love her. They hold her. They comfort her. They give her support. They give her food, everything she needs. She's protected. And on a psychic level, she understands this. She knows this. Deep inside, she knows that she's protected and loved. So the child it grows up a little bit, and it starts exploring its world, doesn't it? It becomes in awe of everything out there. It sees animals and birds and walks around on the carpet. It's enjoying life. It starts to motivate on its own, crawl around. Then parents teach it to communicate, because communication is so much easier if the child can tell you when their diaper is full or when they're hungry, rather than just crying. Initially, communication is limited to grunts and whatnot, but the parents are the teachers of the child, right? So the first schooling that goes on, if you can call it schooling, is homeschooling, where the parents teach the child to talk, and they teach them to talk in the language that the parents have. So it doesn't matter if your child is what country it's in, it's going to learn to speak the language the parents have. After the child is brought up to a certain age where it can now function and communicate socially, usually when they're little they learn to play with their friends and whatnot, and they learn that they have to share their toys. How do you teach children? How do you teach a dog? How do you teach anything? Usually you use consequences. So although you're loving with your teaching, you tell the child, I'm sorry, Matilda, you can't go out into the street. It's dangerous out in the street. And although it's hard to communicate danger to a child, you teach them no, and they understand that, and they get it. And after a while, they teach the parents, no, mommy. Okay, so what happens on the first day of school? The parent is there going, okay, now it's time to go to kindergarten. I'm going to take you to school. And the child goes, no, I don't want to go. He's afraid of going to school, or she's afraid of going to school. But she goes, and then now we're no longer near mommy and daddy, right? We've lost that connection. We're off on our own, and it's scary. So you go to kindergarten, and the first thing you have with schooling is you have an authority figure, right? Everybody in the class is 5 years old. They're all small people, and they're not mature. Their bodies aren't mature. They can't defend themselves. And who are they in there with? They're in there with a teacher who is full-sized, fully mature. And so there's this immediate having to be compliant to somebody who's not your parent. And does the teacher love the child like the parents love the child? Of course not. Can't, right? That's an impossibility. Does the child know this deep in their heart? Of course they do, right? So what happens in the school is that now you have, 25 kids running around, and you have to have some kind of order. And in order to do that, you have to have compliance and uniformity. You can't have 25 kids deciding to do what they want. When you were at home and you were being homeschooled, and if mommy was taking care of you, that's kind of like one-on-one, isn't it? But when you go to regular school, you can't have that one-on-one anymore. It would be very expensive, and there'd be no point in going to school. You might as well just have the child stay home. You might as well homeschool them. But they go to school. So how does the teacher get them to comply with their orders? I mean, I don't know, but my guess is you won't comply with the orders, then I put you in the corner. Face the corner, face the wall. I remember when I was a kid, you got to go back to the cloakroom. That was punishment. You can't be with the rest of the kids. So it's self-inflicted punishment. If that doesn't work, trip to the principal's office. More punishment, right? And if that doesn't work, social punishment. What's social punishment? The teacher tells the rest of the students there that we're not going to watch the movie because Johnny there is acting out. And until Johnny can control himself, we're not going to watch the movie. Or we're not going to listen to the story that I'm going to tell. I'm going to read out of the book. Everybody wants to hear me read out of the book, but I can't read out of the book until Johnny controls himself. Then all the rest of the kids in the class start going, Johnny, control yourself. Johnny, Johnny, Johnny. And there you go, social control. Before long, the willful child is taught that there's no place for being willful at school, and compliance is a must. Then there's other forms of compliance, like nods towards we don't allow individuality. You go to Catholic school, everybody has to wear the same uniform. Does wearing the same uniform make you feel like you have a right to be independently expressive? No. I mean, you can't. Every human wants to do things that make them feel individually expressive, right? I mean, when you were a baby, you had your favorite blanket. Could somebody give you a different blanket? Is that going to work for you? No. You want your favorite blanket because it's reassuring, it's yours. And, you have little girls that go to school and they want to wear their pigtails with a bow in them. That bow is for them. That's what they want to express themselves. What if you have a school that doesn't allow you to do that? Denies you any right to be expressive of your own personality, to say, I'm different, right? Some people want to be the center of attention and they wear bright colors or whatever, and then other people want to hide and fall back into the into the mass, and so they want to sit in the back of the room or something. Doesn't matter where you want to be, you still want to be expressive of what you want. What if you can't be? What if you're denied that right to be expressive of what you want? We're not talking about encouraging people to become more expressive or to become more withdrawn. We're talking about just the denial of, expressing yourself. So another aspect of training children to be obedient and conform is the fact that when you go to school, you're impressionable, right? I mean, the Nazis have done studies on mind control, and they figured out this is, the sick, twisted part is that people would actually experiment on other people, but, that's just, we have to live with the fact that that's what happens. And they found out that to create multiple split personalities, that the best time to do that was, 3 years old, through extreme trauma. You put a 3-year-old in an extremely traumatized position, and they will want to leave their body and allow another entity in, or create a second individual that can deal with that trauma. So when you go to school, It's no mistake that, you go to school when you're 5 years old and you become very impressionable to what's, put upon you. So schooling starts when you're young, and, the first time that schooling was forced in the United States was in the late 1880s, I believe. And they actually used the military to round up kids and force them to come to school. And the idea would be like, if you were a tyrannical dictator and you wanted everybody to comply with your orders, wouldn't the best way to do that would be to have the whole tribe send their children to school, a school that you controlled what was taught in and how, discipline was handled? Of course. You can't have homeschooling, because those that are homeschooled actually are probably going to learn more than those that are in school, and they're going to be better suited to adapt to life on the outside. But you want schooling that is not costly to you, but that enforces your will on the students. And within a couple of generations, within 2 or 3 generations, you're going to have a very compliant population. What's the goal of school? To teach obedience, right? To teach uniformity, to teach the fact that you are not allowed to question authority. And I'm not saying that everybody should run around and question authority constantly, but come on. If you can't engage in conversation, then you're only enforcing your will on another at the barrel of a gun or through some physical threat or social threat. I'm going to present some videos by famous educators, and I think they'll be inspiring to listen to. And I was shocked at some of the observations that John Taylor Gatto makes in his video. So we're going to move on to watching John Taylor Gatto and Charlotte Iserbyt.
I believe, and then I argue with it, and it never survives. How about that? Now, what scares me is that when I go back to it year after year, most of it doesn't survive. I mean, it takes years before I get to a core and I say, I'm not personally capable of moving beyond this thing, so that we're so well conditioned from infancy not to see the truth or relate the truth, but to shave it, that the first step in reaching for an education, I think, is to mistrust what you most are certain of, to mistrust that. Now, it may survive, but it needs tested not once until you're exhausted from testing it.
Is the school system designed to get kids to grow into a thriving, self-responsible, self-reliant adult? Or is it to whittle away curiosity and to kind of stop them from thinking for themselves?
It's certainly not the former in any way, for the simple reason that throughout history, management doesn't know how to manage independent units, even partially independent units. Why shouldn't we ask, and any school people watching your film should begin immediately to ask politely, why are we doing this? It's a question you never hear because it's heresy. I mean, the beleaguered classroom teacher doesn't know why he or she's doing that. They're told to do it. Maybe they can give it 5% personal spin. That's why they're doing it. Does it make sense for this particular life that's asking you the question? You don't know, and if you started to care, the logic of schooling would dissolve. No one is able. You can answer the question for yourself. I used to say to my classes, And over the course of 30 years teaching, I taught kids from the Gold Coast to the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I taught kids from the center of Harlem and Spanish Harlem. And I would say to all of them, you have a right at any time, you gotta be polite though, because I'm just human, to say, why are we doing this? And if I can't produce an answer that convinces you that I believe it, then you have a right to opt out and do something else, as long as you don't run wild and bring the whole house down. It helped me grow year after year. Not that they ask very often, because they're conditioned not to do that, but enough did ask that I was put on my own mettle to say, why am I doing this? Is the intimate interrelationship between the economy and the way we train the young. To the extent that we once had a wildly variegated economy. I'm quoting Abraham Lincoln in 1859, famous speech of the Wisconsin Agricultural Association. Lincoln said, I call this mudsill theory because he used that term. Lincoln said the British are financing the whole Western movement, and they're attempting to reinstall their class system. And so they send their young sons over to make sure that not a whole lot of attention is paid to ordinary people or people who live in simple homes that have mud sills. He said they're not, according to the British thinking, they're not worth training or worrying about because there's no way they can possibly improve. Lincoln said, look around you. 3/4 of our population has an independent livelihood, and the quarter who doesn't works to put a little stake together to set up on their own and write their own script in life. He said, as a consequence, we don't have proletariat as they do in Britain and Germany and the European nations, and we aren't able to have a factory system. But of course, the Civil War changed that. We're sold that it was a great crusade against slavery by the school system. The major historians who've turned their attention to that say, I mean, to a person, that slavery was already dead. It was staggering through its last couple of generations. And a number of historians 50 years ago said slavery was on its last legs because the Southern womanhood wouldn't stand for it any longer. Russia, I believe, had freed the serfs. Britain and the continent had done this thing. We were going to do it too. A wage slave.
Right.
And think only about the welfare idea. If you have a plantation family and you require harmony, even though some people are very subordinate, if somebody gets sick or too old to work, you can't in fact do the Simon Legree bit and get rid of them, or what happens is morale collapses. So you have to care for them. The discussions on the highest level among northern industrialists, why should we have to support Deadwood here? And we could do that if they were wage slaves. Yeah. But finally it occurred to him that with these masses of immigrants being brought in to break the Irish labor monopoly in the mines and the mills, that the easiest way to lower the unit cost of labor was to bring the husband and the wife into the labor force. You double the size of the labor force, you cut the unit value of labor in half. But you couldn't do that as long as they were worried about their kids. So now you have the impetus to enlarge the social work industry, to corrupt the legislatures, to give it the power to break families apart. And what do you do with the kids? Well, the expression put up for adoption tells you you don't want them anywhere in the neighborhood. You want them far away. So you put them in boxcars. This great secret monstrous event in American history that goes on for 40, 50 years. Boxcars full of the children of the labor sent west. They started upstate New York. That was too close. So they kept going farther and farther west. And then they'd stop at a whistle stop, and a platform would be brought out. The boxcar would open. The children would be put up for adoption. School removes your volition in all important ways. Even who you speak to. Are not the arts of association as valuable or more valuable than anything else you learn when you're young? I read how executive hiring is done, and it almost never has to do with your training in whatever you're being hired for. Is this the I'm thinking of Apple now, I believe. Is this the person we would like to have around 3 years from now? And bend an elbow with, or play golf with, or just talk with? I mean, and that's why you're passed from set of executives, so they can sign off, yeah, he's okay, we can, but we don't tell kids that, right? It's people who have the highest grade point average and the highest SAT scores. Well, I spent an hour, not too long ago, within 10 years, with the admissions officer for Harvard College, and about 30 years ago, an hour with the admissions director at Princeton. And let me tell you, their polite dismissal of grades and SAT scores was intimidating to listen to, as if you'd have to be crazy to let somebody in. Let me see if I can condense how you get into Harvard or Princeton. Of course, you get into both by donating a building, but how do other people get in? They're being analyzed on the basis of their ability to either become wealthy or famous. Either one will work. Famous, like wearing a billboard saying, I went to Princeton. There's that actress Jodie Foster, I went to Princeton. Look at where the rest of the actors and directors went. They didn't go anywhere, but Jodie did, so that's one we hear about. The Harvard lady said, we look for a record of excellence. And what does excellence consist of? It's sometime in the first 18 years of your life, figuring out how to add value to the people around you. Although she didn't say this, in a way that catches public attention. So you might walk across the United States, or bicycle the perimeter of the country, or row across the Atlantic Ocean. Those are physical ways. You might start a little charity, or set up some weather service, or some pollution monitoring around Hartford. There are a substantial number, a small fraction, but a substantial number of kids doing this as we sit here. They're writing a record of being able to add value to the community around them. And then the other fellow The Princeton guy said the same thing in different words. I asked him, this about 68 roughly. I asked him, what part of a resume submitted do you look at first? And the answer metaphorically caused my jaw to open. Hobbies, he said. I said, I've been taught all my life, leave that off because it's not germane. He said, on the contrary, it's the only honest information you're likely to get. How does someone spend their time when it's their free choice to spend? He said, it's a window into their mind and their heart. Well, what kind of hobbies? He said, well, ideally someone would have a physical hobby, an intellectual hobby, and a social hobby, because that would show they're exploring these large, physical hobby. You mean football, baseball? Well, he said, it's better than nothing, but we would prefer not to see teams. I said, I've been told all my life that team sports identify your ability to work in a team. He said, what happens in a team sport is if you decide to dog it, it's very hard to tell which guy on the line has dogged it or not, or which running back has gone down quicker than he should have gone down. There, he said, we prefer solo hobbies that involve physical danger. You mean you want kids to put their necks at risk? For example, what? I said. He said, well, horseback riding is a dead giveaway. The horse weighs a half a ton or more. If you do trail riding, you don't know what you're doing. Your head gets caught on a branch and you're the headless horseman. If the horse doesn't like you, it'll roll over on top of you. And I know immediately, because that last time I rode a horse was down in Veracruz, Mexico. The horse didn't like me. Took me out on the main highway with crazed Mexican drivers going 100 miles an hour in 18-wheelers, and it laid down on top of me. I was terrified because I could see these trucks coming. Didn't like that. Was the last time I rode. So he said, you have to actually know what you're doing. You can't say, is this an A job or a B job? If you live and are intact at it. Then he said, sailing a small boat, these little 12-footers outside of land. If you don't know what you're doing, you end up in the middle of the Atlantic, or if wind comes up, you can't see landmarks because of the waves. I said, but those things are associated with the prosperous classes. What could somebody in ordinary circumstances do? He said, well, we just let somebody in. This is probably one of the nicest factoids in my mind, in my life. We just let someone in who invented his own sport and kept records competing against himself, his past performance, his present performance. It was, get ready for this, visualize this, seatless unicycle riding over broken terrain. If I had 10 lifetimes, the thought of doing that wouldn't occur. Started getting on a unicycle, let alone one without a seat, let alone riding it over broken terrain. So they let him in because they knew he was on the fast track. So we tell these lies, and of course many of the people who tell the lies believe the lies. Well, surely they're going to take valedictorians. Well, last year Harvard turned down 8 out of every 10 valedictorians who applied, and the 2 they took in, they didn't take in because they were valedictorians there. So by removing this component from the student imagination, you can control to some extent who even applies for it and then who gets in, who applies, because they don't know what they're doing. What's the IT garbage in, garbage out? Schooling is a form of adoption. You give your kid away at his or her most plastic years to a group of strangers. You accept a promise, sometimes stated and more often implied, that the state, through its agents, knows better how to raise your children and educate them than you, your neighbors, your grandparents, your local traditions do. And that your kid will be better off so adopted. By the time the child returns to the family or has the option of doing that, very few want to. Their parents are some form of friendly stranger too, and why not? In the key hours of growing up, strangers have reared the kid. Now let's look at the strangers, of which you were one and I was one. Regardless of our good feeling toward children, regardless of our individual talents or intelligence, we have so little time each day with each of these kids, we can't possibly know enough vital information about that particular kid to tailor a set of exercises to that kid. Oh, some of us, will try more than others, but there simply isn't any time to do it to a significant degree. So what we do is accept, and of course if we don't accept this, we're fired or harassed. We accept a state's prescription that's written in manuals. You do this first and this second and this third, and here you have a little latitude to talk to the kids. And the way the state checks on whether you've followed that diet is there's standardized tests given at intervals. If your kids do badly, it does not mean that they're bad readers or anything else. It means that they haven't been obedient to the drills the state set down, and they're marked for further treatment later on, or they're marked to be excluded from responsible jobs. Perhaps some ways by being excluded from the colleges that lead to responsible jobs, in other ways from the licenses that lead to responsible jobs. This was all worked out. It didn't evolve by a lot of rational people saying, we'll take this, this, and this from the past, then the next generation will take this, this, and this. This was set down largely in a handful of places. Prussia was perhaps the most prominent of those places. And the Prussian experiment leaped into the United States almost immediately in the 1840s, leaped into the United States. Its propagandists covered the country here. Its backers, its financial backers, set up the most important teacher training institutes and financed those institutes. And then no one was allowed to become a teacher who didn't more or less subscribe to the fact that experts could create a curriculum and pedagogues could administer it. Well, that's exactly what Horace, the Roman essayist, talked about in several of his essays. He said, the master creates the lessons. The pedagogue, the teacher, administers the lessons. But if you find the teacher creating the lessons or deviating from the direction those lessons are headed in, you get rid of the pedagogue. But the people who gave us schooling weren't these wealthy people. They were utopian thinkers who believed the family and tradition were the greatest obstacles to making a perfect society, a utopia. And every utopia that survived invents schooling long before we had universal force schooling. There were always little neighborhood schools, and they all invent universal schooling of a homogeneous variety in order to reach utopia. Now let's shift to the basis of your question, which is Rockefeller and Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. These people saw a different kind of utopia through solving the problem of production with high-speed machinery. They saw that material abundance could be created, and that want, first of all, of course, they thought they could become supremely wealthy, which they did. But secondarily, they weren't beasts. They thought that this material abundance, since they had abandoned a belief in a creator or an afterlife, this material abundance was the best that a human life could aim for. And to do that, the family had to be moved off center stage, and the children had to be processed like raw materials. These are the people who saw to it with their influence that when legislation that was wildly radical based on any past model was proposed, that the right legislators would vote that legislation through. They saw to it that money was available to build these vast piles of brick and stone and to drain children out of the community by the force of law, mind you. If you gave children and families options, it probably would take half a decade before many people tried the options. But I think inside of a decade, the institutional schools would vanish because they don't teach the way children learn, nor can they teach the way children learn. That's not what they're set up to do. They're set up to produce a predictable, homogeneous, safe product. They're set up to sort people into occupational categories, roughly consonant with what the current economy demands.
My name is Charlotte Thompson Iserbe, and I served as Senior Policy Advisor in the United States Department of Education under the Reagan administration, during which I had access to all of the most important documents for the restructuring of not only American education, but global education. And I'm also the author of The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, which gets into all of this, gives the background of what I saw not only in the Department of Education, but as a local school board member. I was trained to identify the resistors to the sex ed, drug ed, alcohol ed, suicide ed, death ed, those good, smart Americans who realize that anything that has education hanging off the end of it is probably not what they're looking for. I was trained to identify those good people and to go up against them, and actually to go and try to get them to join us through the group process system, make them feel important, get them on a committee. And that just blew my mind. I have to say, people often ask me, what is it that got you involved in education? Well, finding out what I saw at the local level certainly upset me. When I went and I saw that Americans were being trained to identify resistors, then I got pretty upset. And luckily, there was a big book that came with the in-service training called Innovations in Education, A Change Agent's Guide. And I was able to take that back home with me. Unbelievable examples of how to con the Christians and different people who are upset with what you're trying to do, how to bring them over to your side. Case studies, true case studies of educators who had put programs in that normally, in a normal American town, nobody would want them. How did they manage to get them in? How did they con the people? And the other thing was, not only was I trained to identify the resistors, I was trained to go to the important people, high-profile, highly thought-of people in the community, with the Rotary, Chamber of Commerce, Garden Club, you name it, the different groups in our towns. Go to them and convince them of the importance of these new programs like sex ed, drug ed, I just mentioned all of them, and to get them on your side, because when you can get the leadership in a community to go along with it, then the newspaper comes in and says, a committee's been set up with the head of the Rotary and this and that, and they're all getting behind this task force to discuss whether we're going to have a new sex education program. And then when Mary Jones, who ordinarily would think, why would we want to have a sex education program when we don't have any problems with kids having sex or anything? So she might be concerned. She might be one of the resistors. She reads that her best friend, who's the head of the garden club, is on this committee, and she thinks, oh, well, hey, Mary Appleton is on that committee. She's heading it up. It must be okay. So I was taught really how to con the community. They always call everybody by the first name. You have to get very, affectionate with people, and you say, William, I'm so glad you've come to this meeting, and I understand your concerns about this program, because I've had other people, usually it's the really bright people in the community who have these concerns, and would you like to join our group? The original program was funded by what would subsequently become my office. It was funded by the Office of Research in the U.S. Office of Education, because it was funded early on, about the late 60s. Still funded, by the way. And the money went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor to a professor by the name of Ronald Havelock. And he was the one that put together the whole training, the whole seminar, the book. And in the back of the book they admitted it. Right in the back of the book, they had about 100 major change agents listed from all over the country. Some of them I recognize, some I still don't, but some I do. And so this was a very important project. And it was being carried out I'm sure, all over the country, not just where I was. This was in Searsport, Maine, this lovely little town on the coast of Maine, in the school there where the guy came in, the facilitator, not Professor Havelock, but a facilitator, to train us. And these were good people that were there. They were some of the teachers from my school, where I was on the local school board, principals, etc. Normal-looking Americans. You really ask yourself, they must themselves have reacted very much the way I did. That's why I've always had a lot of understanding for teachers that have to go through this stuff. I didn't have to continue going through it. They've had to, through the years, constant training, retraining, sensitivity training, break their values. Right, no wrong. You've got to have all religions represented, so, tolerant of everything, and because that's the New World disorder, excuse me. Professor Benjamin Bloom is probably the most important behavioral psychologist ever to live. I mean, maybe not quite as much as Pavlov and Skinner, but he really implemented the system in education in the United States. And he was the author of the taxonomy of educational objectives. And I know that doesn't mean much to us. It means a lot to teachers. They know. All teachers have to go through that, Bloom's taxonomy. And just to give you an idea of how blatant they are, Benjamin Bloom said the purpose of education, and I often say this to parents, really listen to this. You think the purpose of education is reading, writing, and arithmetic? The purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students. And then he goes on and he says, he defines good teaching, and this is even worse from the parental standpoint, as challenging the student's fixed beliefs. And then, in some of his works that I have, that are in my book, a lot of this stuff is in it.
When he says challenge, does he mean challenge or does he mean change? Change their fixed?
Yeah, through challenging. It's through challenging. You go up against them, and you change them. And you asked a good question, because then he goes on in one part of the taxonomy that is in my book, he says that he can take a student from here to there, from a belief in God or his country or whatever, to being an atheist and not believing in his country in 1 hour.
Did he do that?
Oh yeah, he does it. And I've seen it with students. I've seen it with young people. And they don't even know, and teachers don't even know. That's why if you talk to teachers about it often, They really have an awfully hard time dealing with it. And if you go up to a superintendent, an educational administrator, superintendent, or whatever, and you ask him or her, have you ever been through sensitivity training? They'll usually crack up because they went through it. They're the worst, those programs. I've been through them. I mean, how can anything be worse than some of the ones that the regular classroom has, but they're the worst.
What do they teach the children?
To bring about change. They put them through role-playing, psychodrama, all these psychological techniques where they play the part of starving children, and the other one plays the part of a very wealthy industrialist child. And, you know, they bring about the attitude and value change through the emotions. You know how young people are. You know, they're naturally very altruistic, and they want to help, and they don't like to see poverty around the world. And so what they'll do is, just like I think I mentioned to you earlier, or I don't know whether I did, going into the teacher putting in the new social studies program in our community and walking through, taking the little tots through town and identifying big rich people's houses and small poor people's houses. That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Getting them young and making them feel sorry for the people who live in the trailer across from the captain's house, because they only eat hot dogs, not steak. And then they'll do the same thing with Ethiopia or wherever, some third world country, showing them the children dying, and then they'll show pictures of our affluence. And what do you eat for breakfast? Oh, you have eggs and bacon and cereal and orange juice and grapefruit and everything. Yum, yum, yum. Do you really think it's fair? Common unity. That's what we call it, common unity. It has no role for the individual in the community, and for everything that goes on in the Soviet Union, or communism, is based on the community, the commune.
Okay, now that we've watched those episodes, did you find anything amusing and interesting about their recollections and observations about being educators and being on the school board? And you can start to see with Charlotte Iserbyt's points that the government has a program wherein it is trying to deal with putting its programs in place and countering any resistance. I think that's pretty interesting, because at this point we're suffering with, the United Nations under Agenda 21 is trying to infiltrate local communities and come up with ways of dealing with people that are resistant to what they want to do. So it's not an open discussion where questions are answered and, authority is proven, and, there's a discussion about what's good for the whole. It's just, or compliance with law. It's just a matter of trying to get the dissidents removed from the discussion. So anyway, now I want to just for a minute discuss the relevance of education. I find it amazing when I think about it that the society has made education mandatory. Basically, there's truant officers. You are required to attend school for the first 12 years, right? Grades 1 through 12 are required. And there's all kinds of requirements made on the community to do immunizations and other kinds of things related to school, right? So how come, if education is such a boon, and they figure after grades 1 through 12 you're pretty conditioned, right? They must feel that the conditioning is done, the mind control is over, we don't need to do any more than this. Suddenly you go into college and higher education and it's not free anymore. Why not? I mean, is education a right? I mean, if it's a right, then shouldn't you be allowed to have as much education as you want? I mean, as long as you can pay for your own food and lodging, you should be able to go to school and have teachers teach you skills for free. What's the benefit to society of free education? I mean, I guess you could have perennial students that never want to leave school, but at some point they have to have a trust fund or some way of supporting themselves, right? Otherwise you couldn't go to school forever. Even just, maintaining a life, regardless of whether you went to school all day, would be some kind of work on your part. But higher education became, the powers that be must have decided that higher education was not a necessity, even though higher education is what creates people that invent things, right? You go to a higher education for degrees in engineering, let's say. You want to build skyscrapers, you have to have somebody teach you how to do the mathematics and how to do the design and whatnot. So if you don't have these, becoming doctors or nurses or higher education in those kind of fields, if you don't have that offered, how do you have a society that has high-level competent individuals in it? Where are the people that are going to invent things going to come from? Or do they just invent them at home, right? Where is the inventiveness and the creativity going to be sponsored except in higher education? I mean, it should be sponsored in lower education, but it isn't. So you have higher education that I talked to my uncle, and he said back in 1960s, he went to Berkeley. You know what the cost for going to Berkeley in the 60s was? A class was $50. That was it. You basically had to pay your own food and lodging, but going to school was subsidized. $50 to go to Berkeley, and Berkeley's a pretty high-end college. Now, over $10,000. Over $10,000 in addition to paying for your own food and clothing and whatnot, right? So what's the big difference? Why over $10,000 now? And think about this for a minute. Let's say your average class had 25 students in it, and each one of them was paying $10,000. If you're in a class all day for every day of the school year, you basically would consider it like having one teacher having 25 students. And for that year, that 25 students would pay in $250,000. And yet the teachers make maybe $80,000 a year. So obviously it's not subsidized anymore. In fact, you could make the argument that it's a for-profit business. My son went to college, and the dorms cost him $350 a month. That's what they took. And for $350 a month, the room was like concrete block, the most ugly room. You couldn't rent that room if you were a motel to save your soul. It was about 10 feet wide and maybe 14 foot long, and there was a bed on each side of it and a desk at the end. That's what you get for $350, and then there's two people in the room, so that's $700. And since the college doesn't have to have any building code requirements placed upon it because it's a state institution, they could build outside the height limits of the local city. They could build whatever they want there, basically. The cost for construction, because I used to do construction, is pretty minimal. Maybe $30,000 an apartment, actual cost for building. And if you regulated that out over the years, the actual cost for that dorm room should have been something on the order of maybe $125, split in two, be $60 a piece. But instead it was $300. I'm telling you, everything that the government does these days is for profit, and it's not for the benefit of the people. It's stated purpose, right? So then we're going to go on, and we're going to show some video off of YouTube that describe obedience and obedience to authority, basically. There were two experiments. Both of them were done around the 1960s. One of them was called the Milgram experiment, and the other one was called the Stanford Prison experiment. And I mean, if this doesn't shock you after watching this stuff, I don't know what would. it shows the level of mind control that has gone on in society. And this was the level that had gone on back in the 60s, right? Up till that time, when people were still marching in the streets and bumper stickers on cars were "question authority." These were random studies of average, everyday people. So let's watch and see what you think.
I was the first one to be picked up, so they put me in a cell. They locked me in there in this degrading little outfit.
Hey, I don't want anybody left. Violate the rules of the simulation! I gotta go to a doctor, anything. Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside, don't you know?
I've never screamed so loud in my life. Never been so upset in my life. It was an experience of being out of control.
This is fucking take it.
Stanford University, Northern California, one of America's most prestigious academic institutions, and in 1971, the scene of one of the most notorious experiments in the history of psychology.
I was interested in what happens if you put good people in an evil place. Does the situation outside of you, the institution, come to control your behavior, or does the things inside of you, your attitudes, your values, your morality, allow you to rise above a negative environment?
The negative environment Zimbardo chose to test his ideas was a prison. He would convert the basement of the university's psychology department into a subterranean jail.
We put prison doors on each of 3 office cells. In the cells, there was nothing but 3 beds, and there was actually very little room for anything else because they were very small. And here we had solitary confinement, which we call the hole. And in the hole was the place where prisoners would be put for punishment. It was a very, very small area. When you closed the door, it was totally dark. All the guards wore military uniforms, and we had them wear these silver reflecting sunglasses. And what it does is you can't see someone's eyes, and so that loses some of the humanness, the humanity. In general, we wanted to create a sense of power. That is, the guards, as a category, are people who have power over others. In this case, power over the prisoners.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Will you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Where?
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer. Horse.
Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Refuses to go on. The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man today. I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music. And
2/3 of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering with less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
What is there in human nature that allows an individual to act without any restraints whatsoever, so that he can act inhumanely, harshly, severely, and in no way limited by feelings of compassion or conscience? These are questions. In this setting, I allow things to be done to me that I wouldn't allow in any other context. The dentist is about to put an electric drill into my mouth. In this setting, I willingly expose my throat to a man with a razor blade.
Stanley Milgram, which was one of the most influential social psychologists of his time, wanted to understand and find an explanation as to how the Nazis were able to persuade many Germans to partake in the slaughter of innocent people, and to explain why so many did almost nothing to prevent suffering within their own nation.
Stanley Milgram, one of the most influential social psychologists of the time, was particularly fascinated with the dangers of group behavior and blind obedience to authority.
He conducted at least 21 variations of his basic experimental model. On a sample of average American adult men were willing to punish another person with increasingly higher voltage of electric shock.
In 1962, Stanley Milgram shocked the world with his study on obedience. To test his theories, he invented it would become a window into human cruelty. In ascending order, a row of buttons marked the amount of voltage one person would inflict upon another. Milgram's original motive for the experiment was to understand the unthinkable, how the German people could permit the extermination of the Jews.
Results show that people will obey an authority figure regardless of what the consequences may be. Women and men did not differ in obedience rates, and for those few who refused it, made little difference to have a model, because they continued to obey as often as those without the model. One of the experiments was arranged with a teacher and a learner. The teacher was supposed to ask the learner questions, and every time that the learner got it wrong, a voltage shock would be given to the students.
How is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
The graph shows how the level of people's obedience decreases depending on the circumstances. In the initial study, 65% of the people obeyed, and the lowest level when two Confederate rebels confront with 10% obedience.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. All right, now the next thing we'll have to do is set the learner up so that he can get some sort of punishment.
What inspired Milgram, I would say there were a number of factors. One of them is he was very ambitious. He wanted to make a mark in social psychology. And he wanted, as he wrote to one friend, he wanted to come up with the boldest experiment that he could think of.
Would you roll up your right sleeve, please? This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Do you have any questions now before we go into the next room?
About 2 years ago, I was in the Veterans Hospital in West Haven. And while there, they detected a heart condition. Nothing serious, but as long as I'm having these shocks, How strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator.
Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock one step on each error.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105. Hard hit. Just how far can you go in this thing?
As far as is necessary.
What do you mean as far as is necessary?
Milgram was very much aware that obedience is a necessary ingredient for society to function. But he focused on the darker side of obedience.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
It's absolutely essential that you continue. You got no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Now, this man makes disobedience seem a very rational and simple deed. Now, other subjects respond quite differently to the experimenter's authority.
Wrong. It's hair. 75 volts, Jim.
Please continue. Some psychologists were troubled by the ethics of it. Many, if not most subjects, found it a highly stressful, conflicted experience. People are stammering, stuttering, laughing hysterically and inappropriately.
150 volts.
Just for a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out. Let me out.
Clearly, when we say people went to the top of the chalkboard, it wasn't like they were going blithely, sadistically. People went stop and go, stop and go. They were in a state of conflict, which created a tremendous amount of stress. So that was the main critique.
This will be at 3:30.
Like Milgram, Zimbardo was interested in the power of social situations to overwhelm individuals. His experiment would test people's responses to an oppressive regime. Would they accept it or act against it? Zimbardo's experiment was conducted against a backdrop of civil rights activism and protest against the Vietnam War.
There was a sense of student power, student dominance, and student rebellion against authority in general.
It was from the student body that Zimbardo selected his participants. After passing tests to screen out anyone with a psychological abnormality, they were paid $15 a day. Each was randomly assigned to the role of guard or prisoner.
It was a prison to me. It still is a prison to me. I don't look on it as an experiment or a simulation. It's just a prison that was run by psychologists instead of run by the state.
I was 20, and that September I was going to college, and it would be nice to have a summer job, but there sure wasn't a lot of time left. And I looked in the want ads, and I found this thing which was just going to fit. It was just 2 weeks.
Once you put a uniform on and are given a job to keep these people in line, you really become that person. Once you put on that khaki uniform, you put on the glasses, you take the nightstick.
I was on summer break from my first year in college, and I was looking for a job. Had to choose between that and making pizzas. That sounded like a lot more fun.
As well as running the experiment, Zimbardo took on the role of prison superintendent. he began by briefing the guards.
I said, you have to maintain law and order. If prisoners escape, the study's over, and you can't use physical violence.
You can't create a sense of fear in them. You can't create the notion that their life is totally controlled by us, and that there'll be constant surveillance. We have total power in the situation, and they have none.
Prisoners were brought to the basement prison, blindfolded, to confuse them about their whereabouts. They were stripped and deloused.
Of course, the guards started making fun of their genitals and humiliating them. And really, it's the start of what's known as the degradation process, which not only prisons, but lots of military-type outfits use that process.
When I first got here, even though I had to strip and they would call me names, I still didn't feel at all like I was in the prison. I was just looking at it as a job.
I recall sort of walking up and down the very short hallway, which was the prison hall, and looking in on the prisoners, and they're basically lounging around on their beds. I felt it was like a day in summer camp.
The first day I said, this might be a very long, very boring experiment, because it's conceivable nothing will happen.
I arrived independently at the conclusion that this experiment must have been put together to prove a point about prisons being a cruel and inhumane place, and therefore I would do my part, to help those results come about. I was a confrontational and arrogant 18-year-old at the time, and I said somebody ought to stir things up a bit here.
On the second morning, the prisoners had decided to stir things up as well. The guards found some of them had used their beds to barricade their cell. Prisoner 8612 was one of the ringleaders of the rebellion.
Initially, I was stunned. I didn't expect a rebellion because not much happened. I mean, it wasn't clear what they were rebelling against, but they were rebelling against the status, rebelling against being anonymous, against having to follow orders from these other students.
As punishment for the rebellion, prisoner 8612 was put in the hole, and the guards turned on the other prisoners.
The guards felt that they now have to up the ante of being tough. The prisoners made the mistake of beginning to use profanity against the guards in a very personalized way. So not against the guards, but, you little punk, you big shit, and so forth. And the guards got furious.
Well, gentlemen, here it is time for count.
Prisoners were repeatedly woken in the middle of the night. The guards made them do menial, physical tasks and clean out toilets with their bare hands.
We made it a point to not give them any sense of comfort or what to expect, that anything could happen to them at any time, including being rousted from their sleep at any hour and forced to stand up in a line and have me hurl insults at them and make them do exercises. When you interrupt people's sleep, they tend to become a little disoriented, and since there was no daylight in the prison, they had no idea whether it was night or day. I think that I was the instigator of this whole schedule of harassment.
The harassment of the guards took its toll on rebellion leader 8612. He told Zimbardo he wanted to leave the experiment. Zimbardo responded not as a psychologist, but as a prison superintendent.
I said, well, I can see to it the guards don't hassle you personally. And in return, all I would like is some information from time to time about what the prisoners are doing. So essentially I'm saying I'd like you to be a snitch, an informer. And I said, think it over, and if you still want to leave, fine.
Confused, prisoner 8612 returned to his cell and told the other prisoners that no one could leave.
He believed that we wouldn't let him go, although we've never said that. But the fact that he was the ringleader of the rebellion, and he told the other prisoners, they won't let you leave. And that really transformed the experiment into a prison.
I was told that I couldn't quit. And at that point, I just felt totally hopeless. More hopeless than I'd ever felt before.
Soon after returning to his cell, prisoner 8612 started showing signs of severe distress.
God damn it! Fucked up! You don't know, I mean, God! I mean, Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside, don't you know? I just fucking can't take it.
He came up with a plan that if he acted crazy, we would have to release him.
I'm so fucked up inside. I feel really fucked up inside. You don't know. I gotta go. To a doctor, anything. I can't say that. I'm fucked up. I don't know how to explain it. I'm fucked up inside.
It starts with make-believe, and then he's doing it and cursing and screaming and, you know, whatever that little boundary is that he moved across. Not that he became really crazy, but he became, you know, excessively disturbed. I mean, so much so that we immediately said we have to release him.
As an experience, it was unique. I've never screamed so loud in my life. I've never been so upset in my life. And it was an experience of being out of control.
The boundary between reality and make-believe was to become blurred even for Zimbardo. A rumor circulated that released prisoner 8612 would return with friends to liberate the remaining prisoners.
I quickly convinced myself that, you know, my most important function was, you know, not to allow this prison liberation to occur. And what can I do to keep my prison going, not the experiment going?
The prison was dismantled and the prisoners moved to another part of the building. Zimbardo waited in the empty corridor, preparing to tell 8612 and his friends that the study was over, when a colleague appeared and began asking questions about the scientific basis of the research.
I'm trying to get rid of him. Then he says, "What's the independent variable?" I get furious because he doesn't understand that there's a riot about to take place, that this prison is about to erupt. I had totally lost this whole other identity of scientist, researcher, psychologist.
The rumored jailbreak never materialized. The guards had dismantled the prison for nothing and had to rebuild it. They took their frustration out on the prisoner.
I think most people, after watching this, are shocked that average, everyday people could be led to commit assault and battery on other everyday people without any justification whatsoever other than an implied obedience to an authority figure that's issuing them orders, right? But imagine that you go to work in a store, or you go to work as a tradesman, you're an electrician. You go into somebody's house and tell them, issue them orders. If you did, your business would go down the toilet. You wouldn't make any money. Nobody would ever give you a reference, right? So obviously people just take it as, you know, in this line of work I'm allowed to do this, and in this line of work I'm allowed to do something completely different. So what's the difference? I think it's schooling. I think that it's social engineering. I think the fact is that people don't question authority. And people don't, and why would you? Because, you know, unless you involve yourself in some kind of self-help study where you're going to fill out forms and, you know, examine why you answered things the way you did, why would anything change about the way you have belief systems, right? You have belief systems, and where did they come from? If you don't examine what your belief systems are, and if you don't examine where those ideas came from, then you continue on acting and reacting to the pressures of society as they come up. Somebody asks you, will you fill this form out? Well, okay. You know, as Mark Stevens would say, the neighbor comes over and says, you can't build that little gazebo in your backyard. And you go, why not? And they go, because it's the law. It's the law. And without any proof whatsoever, you go, okay. you know, or you continue on, who knows. But the point is that where's the examination of where your belief systems come from? Because if we don't, you know, look in the mirror, start examining ourselves. You know, one of my favorites is when I was younger, my father grew up in the Depression. His number one belief system was that unless you were working, you were worthless. You were a bum. That's a biggie for a lot of guys, I'm sure. And so carrying on the family tradition, I had the same belief system. And I never questioned it until I got a little older, and then I started questioning it. And it's like, is that really true? If I'm not working, am I a bum? And I came to the conclusion, no, it was not true. Just because I wasn't working, I was a bum, and I was worthless, you know, worthless. You're not working, you're worthless. Well, that's a belief system. What if your belief system is different? You know, if I was born to the Rockefeller family, my belief system would be that I'm entitled and everybody else is subservient. I'm born with a silver spoon in my mouth, and everything I say and do has to be considered and obeyed, because who am I saying it to? Unless I'm saying it to my parents, I'm saying it to servants, and that has to be obeyed. So since everybody that I come in contact with is a servant and they obey my every wish and command from when I'm tiny, when I grow up and go out in the world, why would I think it's any different? So a different belief system, right? Not good, not bad, not being judgmental. It's just a different belief system. You know, so if we want to live a life that's compassionate and truthful and honest, then it might be a good idea to just kind of list out on a piece of paper what your various issues are, what your belief systems are, and where do you think they came from. You know, start examining it, started running it down, and like John Taylor Gatto said there, you know, he makes a statement and then he argues against it. He argues against his own statement. And if it can withstand the argument, then it must be okay. And if it can't withstand the argument, and hardly anything ever does, then it's not really a great statement. It's not really a truth. We have to examine why we feel the way we do, right? Why do we feel the way we do? Or are we going to, if we don't examine why, and we don't shift in our viewpoint of what's okay and what's not okay, right? Is it okay for me to tap somebody in the chest while I'm talking to them to enforce my point? Or is that an assault and battery against that person? I mean, assault is verbal and battery is the physical action. So that's a battery against somebody. Maybe I don't see it that way, but they might. And if they file charges against me, then I might, you know, suffer some consequences for jabbing them. Probably not much, but you know what? This is the point. You examine those things, and if you say, you know what, I should respect somebody else's space, not enter their space. If somebody tells me, get out of my face, you're in my face, what's the problem with stepping back a little and giving them some space and making them feel more comfortable? What's the problem with that? Why would I feel that I have to be up in somebody's face? And, you know, we see bullies that do it all the time. You know, they get right up in your face and, you know, get angry and issue orders. And, you know, it's like watching a peacock fluff its feathers up. Look at me, I'm so big and powerful and strong, and I need you to cower in front of me. Is that okay, or is it not okay? These are, you know, belief systems, and if you examine them prior to carrying them out, then maybe you can shift the way you view things. Most people are born and have a certain way of looking at life, and those beliefs that they have are carried with them throughout life. So it's not unusual for somebody to have to be the way they are and not change at all in their life. But I believe that if you want to change and you want to become your idea of what a better version of you would be, you know, then it has to come through examination of your ideas. It has to come through your willingness to examine things and change. So I'm going to show what I'm talking about now with, you know, Mark Twain's picture. Mark Twain was, you know, just wonderful. And he made the statement, quote, "In religion and politics, people's beliefs and convictions are in almost every case gotten at second hand and without examination from authorities who have not themselves examined the questions at issue, but have taken them at second hand from other non-examiners, whose opinions about them were not worth a brass farthing." I mean, that's like the most accurate assessment of people's beliefs that I've ever come across. Rarely can anybody substantiate why they're making a statement about, you know, why they're making a claim with any facts. So if there's no facts to support their claim, then it's an opinion, right? And if you ask them where they got that opinion from, they are like, I don't know. You know, they've never examined it. They've never thought about it. Does that opinion come from your father? Does that opinion come from the church you went to when the priest in there was giving the sermon? Does that opinion come from the teacher at school? Where does it come from? Because if you're making the claim, then it should be your opinion, and you should have some idea of how you arrived at that opinion. Right? So the next thing that I want to point out is that there's a phrase called cognitive dissonance. And in cognitive dissonance, it's where somebody cannot recognize and change what their view is because it's impossible for their mind to see the truth. And, you know, we might think that's funny and impossible, but the fact is that a good example of cognitive dissonance would be thinking that the people in Congress represent us, right? You'll get a lot of people that still think that they can ask their congressmen and petition them for, you know, to have them vote a certain way and stuff, and that the congressman represents them. But that's obviously a complete lie if you take into account the fact that, you know, during the TARP bailout, you had 92% or 96%, depending on which polls you want to look at, of the people of the country stating they didn't want a TARP bailout, and the Congress voted for it anyway. I mean, that's just an extreme example of the fact that if you are actually going to believe that your representatives in Congress will vote the way you want them to, you can't actually have that belief and recognize the truth that the Congress voted alongside 4 to 8% of the people, and that was it. So obviously they're not representing the people. They're not your representatives. Obviously they represent someone else, probably not even themselves. Another example of cognitive dissonance would be the repeated mind control exerted by the media. If everyone remembers, there was a year's worth of constant news that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, promoted by the government, right? George Bush and company, there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction. We don't describe what they are, and I don't even know what a weapon of mass destruction is, you know, but it sounds good. So, without any proof whatsoever, with no facts to justify it, and without any testimony under oath even. I mean, you never saw Colin Powell get on the television and say, I swear under penalty of perjury that I have personally witnessed weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. You don't have them do that, right? So there's no proof whatsoever. There's not even any allegations under oath. And yet the news constantly hammered that point across, to the extent that, you know, after more than a year or two of looking for weapons of mass destruction repeatedly and constantly, they finally had to admit that there were none. They found none. And then you have the famous Rumsfeld quote, you know, the absence of evidence is not an evidence of absence, something to that effect. Ooh, 1984, George Orwell doublespeak. You know, the lies and the lying liars that tell them. So, what we have there is proof positive there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And 6 months later, they did a poll, I believe, and found that, you know, 60% of the population still believed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Well, didn't they get the word? Weren't they interested in the subject? Or is it just because if you constantly repeat on the news agency something is true over and over and over again, obviously it becomes true? Well, of course, it doesn't work on people like me, because I don't believe anything the government says is true. They lie repeatedly, and all I have to do is ascertain that somebody I know has lied to me, and I can never believe them, you know, ever again. I mean, it's not that I won't allow them to make statements to me, and I'll take them with a grain of salt, but I can never accept them as truth ever again, because once the person has shown that they're willing to lie for no real good reason, I mean, they're not trying to protect somebody's feelings from being hurt or something. They're willing to lie for financial gain or for status and honor, you know, for somebody to respect them. If you're willing to lie about things like that, then you're a liar. And liar, I can't accept anything the government says as being truthful. Been burned too many times. So, if everybody was like me, then nobody would believe that stuff, right? And the government has lost, once the government loses all credibility and the news agencies lose all credibility, they're pretty much sunk. They can't tell their lies anymore. So this episode basically is about the social engineering and the refusal of those people that are in authority of answering questions. And there's no justification for not answering questions. There's no justification for it. Unless you believe that it's okay to be tyrannical dictatorship or to work for a tyrannical dictatorship. And that, like the prison experiment, the fact is that you're hired to do a job, and it's my job to violate your rights. You know, I'm not going to even discuss whether you have rights, whether your rights are being violated. There's no discussion here, as an officer told me one time. After talking with me for less than 30 seconds, I'm not going to debate you anymore. I don't know. You're going to arrest me, but you're not going to actually show that you have any valid reason for arresting me? And I'll be honest with you. If you're in law enforcement, you never have to answer questions. And if you do engage in a conversation with somebody or examine your own feelings about things, it may become a case where you can no longer perform your duties, you know, and honor your duties to the job as opposed to your duties to your oath of office. You know, it's like I watched a group of sheriffs talk about their constitutional obligations. But the sheriffs are all elected, and they basically cannot be fired, right? They're elected, so they know they have a job, at least until the end of the term. And if the people like them, they'll be elected again. Whereas if you're a deputy sheriff or you're a policeman working for a chief of police, then, you know, you can be fired without anybody electing you again. That's not a problem. Although, you know, the case for wrongful termination for following your constitutional oath would be pretty strong, and I doubt they would survive if they fired you on some flimsy excuse that you were honoring your oath to the Constitution. But the ostracism by all the other officers would be enough to make you want to quit. However, I believe that if I was a police officer, I don't think anybody could threaten me enough to make me quit when I have an opportunity to help people. Most people understand that the purpose of law enforcement is to keep the average man from becoming a victim of some other man. You know, when I say man, I mean man or woman. So it's victims that you're there to protect, right? You don't want any victims to be created by the acts of other people. And the definition of crime, technically, is where there's a victim. You know, I have court cases that show that you can't have a criminal proceeding unless there's evidence of a corpus delicti, and that means that you have to have an injury or loss and a criminal intent to cause that injury or loss. Unfortunately, you know, 90% of the crimes that are being punished today are not crimes where there's a man or woman who's a victim. It's just for a violation of some legislated act. It's you know, what you would call a victimless crime. So if the state of California is the plaintiff and there's no actual party who you could call a victim, then you haven't really witnessed a crime, and there's no probable cause for arresting somebody unless there's a victim. I think that most officers are most happy when they're investigating a robbery or rape. I mean, I'm not saying you're going to be happy about that, but you certainly would feel that there's a lot of honor and duty in doing those actions, because those are legitimate and valued services to the community. Whereas nobody really feels good about harassing, you know, some poor guy who's sleeping in the park. If you're drunk in public, is that really a crime? If you're drunk in public and bumping into everybody on the street and asking them for money, then that's kind of an irritation. But somebody who is just hanging out and drunk just because he's in public, that's not really a crime. I would like you to, just as a final thing, examine the two parties that I'm going to present on the screen and ask yourself to identify which of those two parties is an authority figure that has to be obeyed. And take notes. And then I want you to ask yourself why you believe that the party that you're picking is an authority figure and has to be obeyed. And then I'm going to ask you to think of, if all men are created equal, and obviously neither of these parties is committing any crime, then why would one party have authority over the other? That's pretty much an impossibility if no crime is being committed. Because the whole purpose of using physical violence to compel obedience to your authority is in the case where somebody is committing a crime. I mean, if somebody's walking out of a 7-Eleven with a shotgun and you've heard shots, you can pretty much guarantee that a crime has been committed. And that party has to be subdued so that they don't continue violating other people's rights. I hope that you've enjoyed watching this program and that you've learned something. Thank you for watching.